Welcome everyone to the broadcasting episode of the podcast on Canada, US, Mexico trade agreement. I'm Scott Prescott. I'm a partner at Fasken. My practice is focused primarily on broadcasting regulation. With me today is Ryley Alp, who's an associate in our communications practice group and works closely with me on broadcasting and media matters. During our episode of this podcast, we will discuss CUSMA's impact on the broadcasting industry in Canada and on the legal framework that governs that industry. So with that brief introduction to this segment, maybe I can ask you, Ryley, to start by explaining what CUSMA currently says about broadcast.
Okay, so CUSMA says three things about broadcasting. The first is a Canadian cultural industries exception. So that's in Article 32.6. So that exception allows us to adopt measures to protect our cultural industries, which includes books, magazines, music, film, video recordings, as well as radio, television, and cable broadcasting undertakings and satellite programming services. So the provision effectively exempts cultural industries from CUSMA. With that being said, if Canada adopts measures to protect its cultural industries, including measures taken under the Broadcasting Act, the US and Mexico can retaliate in two ways. So first, they can adopt measures targeting Canadian goods, services, or content that would normally be inconsistent with the agreement, but are permitted here because they mirror the kind of flexibility Canada receives under the cultural exception. Or they can adopt measures of equivalent commercial effect, which would not necessarily have to be a cultural measure. So Canada can protect its cultural industries, but doing so can trigger these two types of retaliatory measures. A second provision in CUSMA that affects broadcasting is Chapter 19, which is digital trade. It requires the parties to provide non-discriminatory treatment to digital products. This means digital products such as online streaming services, digital platforms, podcasts, online news, user-generated content, and ebook retailers, which all benefit from non-discriminatory treatment. The third way CUSMA impacts broadcasting is found in Chapter 15, which has two very, very specific provisions on cross-border trade and services. So the first requires Canada to allow US home shopping channels to be distributed in Canada, and the second relates to a measure known as simultaneous substitution. So Canada is prevented from adopting rules that would prohibit cable and satellite distributors from substituting the Canadian signal of the Super Bowl over the signal transmitted by a US TV station. So now that we know what CUSMA says regarding broadcasting, Scott, how about you tell us about how the broadcasting sector has been affected historically by trade negotiations, including CUSMA?
Okay, thanks, Ryley. The original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was signed in 1988. It actually included the same cultural industries exception that Ryley just talked about. It also continued to be part of NAFTA when that came into effect in 1994 and until it expired or was renegotiated in 2020. Because of that provision, Canada has adopted a variety of measures over the years to protect the broadcasting industry. I will highlight just a few of them here. The first is that Canada maintains a strict broadcasting licensing regime that includes a strict Canadian ownership and control requirement. This effectively prevents foreign companies from owning and controlling Canadian television and radio broadcasters, as well as cable and satellite distributors. A second measure is the rule that limits the number of foreign linear programming services that can be distributed in Canada. The purpose of this rule is to protect Canadian broadcasters from those foreign services that the CRTC has deemed to be directly competitive with Canadian programming services. And the third measure I'll mention is one that Ryley just touched on briefly, was that the requirement for cable and satellite distributors to substitute a Canadian over-the-air TV signal for a US TV signal when the programs on the two stations are the same and are broadcast simultaneously. This simultaneous substitution rule is intended to protect program rights and advertising revenues of the local Canadian television stations. So the cultural industry exception acts as a shield for these and a number of other longstanding sort of broadcasting statutory and regulatory requirements. which are designed to favor Canadian broadcasting companies. The U.S. has at various times since 1988 objected to some of Canada's measures, including ownership restrictions and simultaneous substitution. They argue that they reduce the value of U.S. programming and limit American companies' ability to compete sort of freely within Canada. Despite that, these cultural carve-outs have remained in place for almost 40 years now. And notwithstanding that they have been the source of a sort of semi-conscious, consistent tension in the Canada-U.S. trade relationship.
Okay, great. So now that we kind of have that background, what do you think might be on the table for renegotiation as a part of the current CUSMA review in the broadcast and media sector?
Yeah, so I think there are two recent statutes that have become trade irritants, um, and they will likely be discussed at the negotiating table this summer, and maybe for many summers to come if a new consensus on CUSMA is not reached this year. The first is the Online Streaming Act. It came into force in 2023. It gives the CRTC, which is Canada's broadcast regulator, the express authority to regulate foreign and domestic online streaming services that operate in Canada. So, among other things, the CRTC has used that new power to require large foreign streamers to contribute 5% of their annual Canadian revenues to support the production of Canadian and Indigenous content. This 5% contribution has been subject to appeal and judicial review by the Federal Court of Appeal, and a stay is still in effect pending the court's decision on those appeals and judicial reviews. The legal challenges were brought by foreign streamers. They questioned the scope of the CRTC's authority under the Act, the specific obligations imposed on foreign undertakings, and whether mandated contributions can be directed to support specific types of Canadian content, such as local Canadian news, which is a type of content that is not provided by those foreign streamers. In addition to these legal challenges, the Act has also been identified by some in the U.S. Congress as a trade irritant. Earlier this year, a bill was submitted to the U.S. House of Representatives targeting Canada's Online Streaming Act. It's called the Protecting American Streaming and Innovation Act. If passed, it would trigger an investigation into the Online Streaming Act under the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, and which allows the U.S. Trade Representative to retaliate, most commonly with tariffs, against a foreign policy or law that is deemed unfair to U.S. commerce. So while Canada continues to invoke the cultural industry's exception, the bill addresses this by noting that the exception, and I quote, traces the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement era and retains a legacy definition of cultural industry centered on traditional publishing, recordings, and broadcasting, rather than modern means of digital delivery, end quote. So based on this, it's clear that the Online Streaming Act is a trade irritant. It will be raised at this summer's scheduled review of CUSMA. Many in the U.S. view it as a threat to trade and see it as a mechanism to force streamers to subsidize Canadian content and culture. Canada's perspective is that the Act levels the playing field for domestic broadcasters and protects Canadian culture. Given U.S. streamers' growing presence in the Canadian market, this issue will come to a head soon, actually. Recently, Canada's minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade indicated that the cultural exemption has not been the focus of trade discussions, and further stated that it would not be on the table. He reassured Canada's culture community that it is the government's commitment to continue along those lines in the future. The second Canadian statute that will likely be discussed at CUSMA review is the Online News Act. It requires two large tech companies to negotiate payments with Canadian news organizations for the use of the content. Google reached a deal to pay $100 million annually to Canadian journalism groups, which includes broadcasters. Meta, for its part, chose instead to block news on Facebook in order to avoid being governed by the Act. So the Online News Act has also been flagged as a trade irritant by the U.S. Trade Representative. Last summer, however, the Canadian Prime Minister suggested that he might consider rescinding the Act so that Meta would lift its ban on news articles being shared on its platforms. Given the U.S. concerns about these two Canadian statutes in particular, they will no doubt be topics of discussion at the CUSMA review. So, Ryley, having identified the two current trade irritants related to broadcasting, maybe you can talk about where Canada might see new trade challenges emerge due to technological innovations.
Yeah, for sure. So I think based off of what you just talked about, going forward, the central challenge is going to be that trade rules written for traditional broadcast and media are being applied to these rapidly evolving digital platforms, which is creating tension between cultural policy objectives and modern digital trade principles. So, as more and more traditional broadcasting content is streamed online and across borders, it's going to become more difficult to impose traditional measures pursuant to CUSMA's cultural industry exception. It's also becoming apparent that while Canada continues to extend cultural policy tools to digital intermediaries, the US is much less willing to accept these measures that they remain defensible under the cultural exception, which was originally negotiated in 1988. So that's well before the rise of these digital platforms and streaming services.
So another question I have is what are Canadian stakeholders saying today about CUSMA and the need to protect cultural industries?
Yeah. So Canada's cultural industry continues to encourage preserving and modernizing the cultural exception for the digital era to reflect the evolving content distribution environment. But for the most part, Canada's production industry and most domestic broadcasters continue to strongly support the cultural protections afforded by CUSMA. So viewing them as fairly essential to maintaining Canadian content production and ownership and independence in the face of massive global competition. There was a recent survey conducted by Polara Strategic Insights, and it was commissioned by the CMPA, which is the Canadian Media Producers Association, and it states that 83% of Canadians support the Online Streaming Act. So still lots of support there. Um, I guess to wrap things up, Scott, what should policymakers and industry and stakeholders expect going forward?
But I think Canada's policymakers and stakeholders should certainly expect heightened scrutiny of Canada's cultural and digital policy measures as part of the 2026 review. While a wholesale renegotiation of the cultural industry exception is unlikely, uh, issues linked to digital trade, regulation of streaming services, and funding of Canadian news programming in particular will surely be discussed. Um, as I said earlier, the Online Streaming Act and the Online News Act have already been flagged as trade irritants by the U.S., indicating that these specific measures will be part of the new CUSMA negotiations. Uh, on top of that, Canada's cultural industry should also be prepared for some continued legal and political uncertainty, particularly when domestic regulatory proceedings, court challenges, trade pressures are all happening at the same time that CUSMA is being reviewed. That state of uncertainty and apprehension will continue to grow if the review does not result in an extension of CUSMA, this summer. And if the parties can't reach agreement this year or next year, CUSMA becomes subject to annual reviews with a potential expiration date of 2036. I think everybody on the Canadian side would agree that such an outcome would be problematic, particularly given that all the other trade-related challenges that exist today. So that's our overview of CUSMA from the broadcasting perspective. We would be happy to hear from any of you that are listening if you have any questions about these issues. We will now turn things over to Leslie Milton and Paul Burbank for episode 3, dealing with telecom trade issues relating to CUSMA.